The Last of Us Part 2 is around the corner. Unfortunately, we don't know how close we are to that corner. Still, ever since the release of the first teaser, YouTube has been rife with theories about where the story will go. And that's a good thing, even if some of those theories are a bit bonkers. Now granted, my experience of gaming overall has been limited to only a handful of titles really, but it seems to me like only The Last of Us has generated as much discussion over the past, well, half decade. Like I said, there's been some nonsense along with many good ideas, but apart from the very occasional video comment, I've kept silent, except for my ramblings on live streams. Now, I'm only making this video because of a suddenly powerful called it temptation. Most of my thoughts have been limited to full game streams, so they've kind of been buried inside those. So this is, if nothing else, it's kind of a single source that we can all refer back to and either laugh at or high-five when the time comes. It isn't really a listing of things I think will happen. To be honest, I'd much rather be surprised. But in many of the speculative videos I've watched, there have been some common threads I disagree with, so really that's what this video is about. Now, this stuff is in no particular order, but I'll start with the idea of infected animals, which all came about because of what most describe as claw marks on a tree in the first teaser. I just don't go for it, and for a couple of reasons. With a single swipe, even the paw of an infuriated bear won't do that much damage to the bark of a very mature tree. The gouges are simply, they're too deep. You also need the motivation. What animal attacks a tree? And if the animal theory is correct, that is an attack. It's not claw sharpening, which would be like a repeated, probably downward series of incisions. The idea of infected animals then, it doesn't work for me, unless the writers want to take suspension of disbelief a tad too far. Remember, this fictitious strain of cordyceps behaves like the real world one. It attacks and reprograms the brain, the human brain, and it's done so with remarkable success. It doesn't need to adapt, but if it did, it would have to be an entirely new mutation designed to infect the brains of our four-legged friends, which are vastly different to ours. It could happen, sure, but it would take thousands, tens of thousands of years, not 5 years. Nature doesn't work like that. It doesn't work to that kind of timescale. But there's one more thing. It's what the story of The Last of Us is based on, namely human relationships and interactions. Even the enemies are presented as people whose lives matter, or at least used to. We see the pained contortions and hear the anguished babble of the infected, and we know that, well, dangerous as they are, they're enduring their own kind of suffering. With many non-infected enemies, we're forced to see them beg for their lives. You know, we need to kill them, but we can't do so until that little animation finishes. In other words, death has human consequences. Now, I know most of us love animals, but I'm sorry, as humans, we're used to killing them. You know, the game encourages us to feel some remorse for the humans we have to kill. And that level of remorse can't be there if you're forced to kill a slavering, infected wolf. Now, what about Laura Bailey's character in the sequel? All we can be sure of is that, given this actress's phenomenal talent and stature, she will be important. Now, way back in my early days of streaming, I put forward this idea that Anna wasn't dead, that maybe Marlene had concocted some Machiavellian scheme to secure Ellie for her own purposes, even to the extent of manufacturing the letter which Ellie believes was written by her mother. Now, I still think that's possible, but I'm far less sure that Anna appears in the sequel. With a handful of other characters already named, the concealment of Laura's identity behind 4 blanks is starting to feel like an overly convoluted psychological game between developer and players. Naughty Dog is far better at surprising than to hide something we all think we know already. So, if not Anna, then who? Well, what I've noticed from videos suggesting somebody other than Anna is that there's a very strong trend towards identifying somebody directly connected to Ellie. Maybe Anna had a sister, maybe Ellie has an older sister. Now, if I'm wrong about Anna's letter to Ellie, that second one makes no sense. Anna wouldn't have a second child if, as she wrote, she basically hates babies. The biological connection idea throws up a problem to me, a logistical one. Ellie was born in Boston and lived there until her journey with Joel. We've been told a significant part of the sequel takes place in Seattle, but we already know the pair have ended up pretty much on the opposite side of the country to Boston, and if they find themselves in Seattle, that's about as far away as you can get. What we know about 2033 post-apocalyptic America is that if you need to get something, even a tiny piece of information from place to place, you basically have to take it there. You don't pick up a phone, you don't email. If Laura's character is family to Ellie, how the hell is she going to find out where she is? Every scenario I can think of which somehow allows Anna, or Anna's sister, or Ellie's older sister, any of these, to find out precisely where she is, I mean some of them are just about feasible, but ultimately all of them tread too far into 1 in a million chance territory. Yeah, okay, it's a work of fiction, and fiction allows that kind of thing to happen, but for me it kind of points towards an extremely important new character, but not one connected to Ellie. Now, what about Joel? There's a popular theory about him being dead in the sequel, and no. Look, Neil Druckmann said a long time ago that Ellie and Joel are The Last of Us. For a million commercial reasons, you can't kill off a character central to the IP. There's no Tomb Raider without Lara Croft. Nathan Drake didn't die at the end of Uncharted 4. Granted, Naughty Dog declared it the end of the series, but if Nathan's dead, they can't change their minds. So, you never know doesn't come into it anymore. And the same applies to The Last of Us. We're all here eagerly awaiting Part 2, but what about Part 3, Part 4? Maybe there are no plans for those, but commercially you don't make them impossible. Some have played with this idea that Joel will be there as some kind of ghostly avatar to help Ellie. Okay, look, any other game, any fantasy world nonsense, fine, you can do that. But The Last of Us is the most grounded game I can think of. It doesn't resort to magic, to the supernatural. Hell, it doesn't even resort to flashback sequences. I just find it very hard to imagine Naughty Dog abandoning the sense of human realism that created such a powerful bond between players and the game's characters. There's an almost inexhaustible corpus of online discussion of the original game, not just about characters and their relationships, but about plot lines and how they affect events and motivate those characters. And to me, that's only been possible because of how the story makes us focus on logical possibilities. When you introduce fantasy stuff, imaginary events, it starts to destroy that chain of logic. So look at it this way. Pretend Joel is dead, okay? And his voice, in inverted commas, speaks to Ellie in a dream, and as a result, she goes on to do something or other, and we're a bit puzzled by it. But we can't ask, why did he say that? Because it was a dream. There's no logic beyond dream logic. Joel is very much alive in the sequel. Now, if Naughty Dog have decided Part 2 is the end, well, even then, I doubt they would kill him off, because that's a closed door that can't be reopened. Right, I've tried not to predict anything for the sequel, just given my take on a few ideas out there, but there is something that occurred to me a while back, and I'll just mention it here because it still makes fairly logical sense. It isn't plot. Actually, well, tangentially, I suppose it might be. It's about the infected. A good few years back, one of the design team put the percentage of dead population at 90%. Yes, there's an artifact in the university in Boulder which says 60%, but that was given at a time when things were being printed and the university was evidently functioning, so it would be outdated. There would have been a point where it was 50%. In other words, for each infected, there was one healthy person available for food or for transmitting the virus. In 2033, we're at the stage where, in theory at least, each infected is competing with 8 others instead of with none at all. Given this decreasing food supply, the lack of new carriers, the virus should be exterminating itself. Would the infected resort to eating animals? Well, to be honest, I think the chances of that are marginal. Despite David covering the dead deer in the hope they wouldn't find it, he might not actually know whether or not it would be of interest to them. Because remember what the cordyceps virus does. It makes the infected attack those of its own species, but it also removes the logic functions, the ability to solve problems. How many times do we see a recently infected, a runner, unable to get beyond a door simply because it can no longer work out the turning of a handle? The infected brain is programmed to attack humans. If humans aren't available, it can't use a thought process to seek an alternative. So for me, it would work nicely if the sequel has fewer infected but more human enemies, in other words. And this would be a nice reference point to Ellie's immunity and the Firefly's obsession with using it to create a vaccine. In other words, humanity is actually re-emerging because the virus couldn't sustain itself long term. Another side of this is that the infected had a dual role. They were a hazard, obviously, but we also knew they were suffering. But they don't have motivations or backstories we can be aware of, so that suffering and our need to put them out of it, it's kind of one-dimensional. We've been there, we've seen it. There isn't more to be said about how the infected are. Maybe there's an opportunity in the sequel to lose some of the infected, but to see an increasing number of factions competing for food, for space, for dominance or whatever, allowing us, the gamers, to form new opinions about groups and individuals. Anyway, I'm not going to try and predict anything else. That's just a couple of ideas. Just my few paltry thoughts there. Hope they've been interesting enough. Thank you for watching, and don't forget, do that like and subscribe thing. Bye all.